Dear guests, dear participants, about 2 years ago, when I was making a program at Hromadske Radio to an anniversary of what we call Revolution Hidnosti, I called to a guy who had called me during those events he called me about some skirmishes that were taking place in this area, in the downtown Kiev downtown part of Kiev. And we quickly, when we started discussing those events we quickly came to the conclusion that our versions of the events were differing significantly. Today, we introduced the book about these events that cover the period of 2013 to 2015, and it's filled with interviews with the people who share their views on those events. Some of the views that you can find here, I'm sure you will have the same impression that I had when I read that book. I finished reading it. I read it all along, and I felt at the end the need for some more similar books. Today we have the authors, all the authors of that book, and the director of the printing house Laurus, who printed that book. We also have Victoria Siumar, who is now the chairman of a parliamentary standing committee, one of the committees, standing committees of the parliament, and the other people who are ready to discuss these events that we call Revolution Hidnosti. We didn't discuss in advance the format of our today's meeting, but I think it's going to be a discussion of all of those who would like to participate. And now let me ask the director of the Laurus printing house. My question is, why did you decide to print this book that was not commercially very promising, let us put it this way? So what was your motive for printing that book? Well,
государственным языком.
Thank you for your question. I'm sorry I cannot speak this official language. And getting back to your question, about commercial viability and lucrativeness, if I may say so, of the printing of that book. I must say that the majority of the books that we publish, they have not been very profitable, but we specialize in historical books, books dedicated to different periods of history, and we were the first, for example, the first printing house that printed Oleg Sentsov's book, and the other printing houses didn't want to publish his book, to print his book. We were the only ones who did that of Oleg Sentsov. As you know, Oleg Sentsov was sent into prison for aiding and abetting terrorism. And still we wanted to publish, and we published his book. We also published the book by Bill Browder, The Red Circular, and you might have seen that book also. We were not concerned by the lack of financial success, commercial success of this book about the events of 2013-2015, but we just considered it our, so to say, our duty to publish that book. And I personally considered it important to have that book published. The events at what is now called the Maidan, it's the word from the Arabic that that was used by the participants of those events to designate the central square of Kiev. So these events that are usually now called by the participants the Maidan events, that book was, we wanted to, we considered the publication of that book important, about the book about those events. Especially with some distance in time that has already passed since that time, I think it has added to the importance of this publication. And it's even more interesting now to see with the years and time passing by, who was assessing and how those events, those Maidan events. So these articles, these interviews that were given yet then in 2013, I think it is even more interesting to read them now and to see from some distance, to take another look at those events. So I think this is a book for the history and for the historians of the future. I was asked why that book is in Russian, not in Ukrainian. Well, because the authors of this book are mostly Russians. I myself am from St. Petersburg, and certainly we understand that it could also be useful to publish that book in Ukrainian, but I would say that it would also be even more interesting to publish that book in English, so that the other countries' audiences could also have the information that this book contained about the events at Maidan. So adjacent, sitting next to Ms. Polina Lavrova, whom I thank for her presentation, is the gentleman who also is one of the co-authors of the book, and the other co-authors are Ms. Samokhvalova from Union Information Agency, and some other authors and co-authors. They are all well known to the public. And we have here people who speak both Ukrainian and Russian, and that's addressing your mentioning the fact that the book is not in Ukrainian but in Russian. So it's we have the events in that book that we call the Second Ukrainian Revolution, because that was the first revolution. So my question to Ms. Siumar is, we have had the first revolution, the second revolution, that was that Maidan. How many revolutions do we need for them to succeed? Well, I would like to refer you to the book saying, for example, mentioning here the episode of the losses by the Alpha unit. It's the Special Operations Unit of Ukrainian army that sustained losses back then in 2014. It showed these losses. They showed the unpreparedness of the Ukrainian armed forces at that time. And I think this story and the other stories in this book are very interesting for those who are interested, who want to read about and to know more about those events. I personally took part in all the meetings of the National Security Council of Ukraine, and I think this book shows that the attitudes and the information from the people who practically managed to preserve that country under that pressure, under those challenges that the country was facing back in 2014. We do not understand sometimes. We do not acknowledge the extent of these challenges, I recall when at one of the meetings of the National Security Council back in 2014, some people were saying that there would be even more losses if these events in Donbass would be pursued. Ukraine would continue to pursue the Donbass unwillingness to stay within Ukraine, the Donbass area. We didn't understand at that time what they meant when they were saying that there could be more losses, but they had the intelligence data, and they were basing their predictions on the data from the Ukrainian intelligence. And I remember that Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the then prime minister, was looking for more people who would be capable of fighting in Donbass, and he was interested in finding the people who would not be only painting the armored personnel carriers and so on and so forth, but would be able to fight as the military personnel. And so that question of what are the results of the events at Maidan, that book answers gives the answers to the questions of what has happened and what have been the changes that have taken place after those events of 2014 that we call the revolution. What changes have taken place here in Ukraine, in the cultural realm, in ideological realm, in political realm, and so on. So this book gives also the answer to the question, who are the real heroes of Ukraine? I'm sure that without that book, the majority of the citizens of this country could only name Nayyem Savchenko as the hero of Ukraine. They do not know the others. And but again, speaking about these events, we can say that they can be repeated, especially now that we have the presidential campaign. There could again be some violent developments with some people willing to take up arms and bring about some changes using force. Nobody can exclude that, such developments. But your book helps to evaluate the path that the country has covered since 2014 and what has been done and what efforts and even losses were made in order to bring about the changes in Ukraine. Well, I would say that some of the historians that will be writing 20, 30 years from now, they will have clearer assessments and evaluations of the driving factors of that revolution of 2014. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Mustafa Nayyem. What's his view of the events of 2014?
У різноманітних своїх якостях.
Ms. Siumar modestly named herself as a witness to these events, but I'd say that she was a very active participant, one of the very active participants, as well as Mr. Mustafa Nayyem. So, Mustafa, what is your view of these events, of that revolution of 2014, and what's your impression of this book? Well, speaking about the events of 2014, I'm not only going to say positive things, but also about the problems. My impressions, my observations of what has been happening since 2014, I'd say that there is a great risk that the events described in this book could be repeated again. And the largest risk, not only for myself, but for the others, if we speak emotionally, we can say that that group of people who know what really was happening in 2014, that group of people is now getting smaller and smaller, and but I cannot exclude the repetition of these events of 2014 again in the present-day situation in Ukraine. And for example, but for me, it's difficult to imagine some of the politicians who took part in those events in 2014, to imagine that, for example, in the other capacities, for example, the spouse of the head of state who participated in the revolution of 2014 very actively is a TV anchor at at one of the TV channels related to the Party of Regions. Well, may I clarify the spouse of what head of state? Well, of our present-day head of state. And we understand that this is what we call the political kitchen. So all these political, combinations and developments, they vary, they change, they transform. But from the point of view of the revolutionaries of 2014, this new capacity of hers was difficult. Is difficult to imagine. I remember that in 2014 we had at Slavyansk, for example, the lawyers, the other representatives of the third sector in sneakers, standing with machine guns in their hands, ready to fight. With all these flashbacks, looking at your book, I can say that it brings about these reminiscences, these flashbacks of memory. And let me say that the events can be the events of 2014 are assessed differently by different people. Those people who participated, they have their views, but the public at large, the members of the public at large, they might have their own views and assessments and impressions of those events. Speaking about these events of 5 years ago, I'd like to say that this year we will have another test of the viability of the results of these events, because at that time it was quite difficult. There were masses of people supporting these revolutionary actions. Today the situation is different. The principles that we fought for 5 years ago are going to be tested and will be tested this year, and those people who participated in those events, they will have to prove that those principles were worth fighting for. And it's a test for us as for the politicians, whether we would be able to sustain these principles and, for example, not to vacillate, so to say, not to get closer to, not to get in some political associations, electoral associations, or unions or something with the Party of Regions, with our opposition members. And I remember that some of the people from the Party of the Regions were saying during the events at Maidan that, these are all those who take part in those events, they are our citizens, so we are not going to confront them. But for me, I'd say that those events were related to the Orange Revolution, and I would like to say about two people. For example, ex-Minister of Justice Lavrinovich and the other people. They, for example, he and some other people, they get into the opposition camp, so to say. And but for me, I'm not going to budge. I will stay on this side of the barricades, so to say, and I will be trying to continue upholding the principles of the revolution of 2014. Well, let me add, Mr. Nayyem, to what you said, that not only Mr. Lavrinovich and the other people you mentioned, or you meant, were getting from the opposition to the ruling camp and back. There has been a number of people, many people, let's be frank about that. And now we have with us also the newly arrived Mr. Nefyodov, who is the first Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. What's your view about this book and about the events, the revolutionary events described in that book? What are the results in your view? What are the outcomes, and what are what future developments are going to be? Well, in reality, the revolutions usually do not take place in 1 or 2 days. If we look at the most, the best-known revolution, French Revolution, as we all know, it has been it was taking place for years, for a number of years. And it was the transition from a monarchy to a republic, then again back to monarchy in France, and so on. And this political process was going on for dozens of years, practically. In Ukraine, it's my impression is that it's quite similar. There were the events that had some indications or some characteristics maybe of some nationalist struggle, or national struggle, I'm sorry, and the attempts were made to construct some national institutions, and it's also the transformation, the transition, so to say. It comprises the transition from the planned economy that there was here in the Soviet time to the market economy, and some of the events had this notion of the association, closer association, approximation with Western Europe, because a lot of people were saying that, China is very far away, Australia and America are far away, but Western Europe is here. Let us get closer to it. And that was one of the major driving factors, as well as the other driving factors, like, for example, for some people there was some religious, some cultural maybe indicators, and it was a big event, as well as the French Revolution was. But if we look at these events not only through the prism of the fight of Robespierre with Marat and the struggle among personalities like as it was happening in France 200 years ago during that best known revolution. We can say, I would say that my views are that answering the question whether these events, these struggles, some of the tragic aspects of that revolution could be avoided, I would say that probably yes, but that process has been painful, the process of transformation, and probably certain mistakes could have been avoided, but certain things they are continuing, and certain developments, as we can see in the parliament, the people are fighting physically in the Verkhovna Rada, in the parliament of Ukraine. I think that all these driving factors, they remain. The possibilities of some violent developments, they remain. Too, maybe after some time we could be able to pass to the English Parliament style of relations when people, do not fight physically but verbally. So. My analogy is that it's like going to a fitness center. You go there, and after your first visit to a fitness center, you start looking at yourself in the mirror, whether you have grown stronger and fit, more fit, and you understand immediately that after one visit to a fitness center, you cannot get immediately more fit or much stronger. Therefore, we all understand that without investments, without efforts, the long-term transformation and significant transformation cannot take place. But I entirely agree with Mustafa, who said that probably what was done back then in 2014 was inevitable, and it was interesting and useful. Well, when you mentioned, when you were speaking, I misheard, and it seemed to me that you mentioned zrada, but you said zradistu, so it was not treason, but on the contrary, with joy. That's how you described those transformations and events. Speaking about the book again, how do you think your book, to what extent your book resulted in what you wanted to see in that book? Well, thank you. Certainly, when you have a, so to say, finished product, you understand always, as it often happens or always happens, that certain things could have been done better. But if I describe you how this process of the creation of that book, I must tell you that when people are reading about the events of 2014, some of them start, seeing some, so to say, false, senses, contents, parts of contents, meanings in that book. But that's normal. Different people have different impressions, and some of the events were misinterpreted yet back then in 2014. With Miss Victoria Siumar, we became friends yet in 2014 when we found ourselves in a sushi bar into which we both came to have lunch. But it happened so that after we lunched there, we had that lunch. We couldn't get out of that sushi bar because the exit was blocked by the revolutionary events in the area here of Kiev. And at that time, I remember that there were the bricks and sticks used by the participants of manifestation and demonstration here in the downtown part of Kiev against the young conscripts who were the personnel of the Ministry of Interior unit that was trying to maintain some order. And at that time, we also saw some old women who were, bringing stones to those participating in those demonstrations, and those stones were thrown into into the police and the Ministry of Interior personnel. I also spoke to the representatives of the Svoboda party, which is the Socialist Nationalist Party of Ukraine under the name of Svoboda, the Liberty, or Liberty. Now it's the name of the party. And when I spoke with them at that time, they were not sure that they would enjoy any support from the public, and but I would say that the events at Maidan proved that a lot of people there was great discontent among the large swathes of the population of Ukraine, because the Ukrainian elites were lying, were corrupt, and all those events, all that discontent resulted in the events of 2014. I'm not going to to shy away, and I will say directly that I'm satisfied. I'm happy that the book was published, containing all those interviews and the different views that you can find and different impressions that people might derive upon reading that book. These differences, they are only natural, and but still, this book is gives food for thoughts. My next question is much less serious. How difficult it is to put very diverging, sometimes opposing views in one book. Well, we tried to do our best so that the book would be somehow stylistically, finished and more or less homogeneous, I would say. I do not know to what extent we managed to do that. Let me say that the first the impression that comes to my mind is that I spoke to one of the authors, the would-be authors, after he read some of the materials of that book. He volunteered practically to write his impressions about the events and become one of the co-authors. And for example, the back of the cover of the book, on the cover of the book, you could see not even the whole photograph, but a part of a photograph that was taken by a mobile phone during those events of 2014. Now the floor is given to Ms. Mustafa, who is one of the co-authors of the book. Why did you decide to become one of the authors of the book? I know that you are a very busy person. Well, I had a personal motivation.
Очень важно зафиксировать.
It was very important to record those events that happened in 2013-2015 in the context that existed then, the context that didn't disappear when we created this book. We were inside the context, but some time passed from the events, from the time of the events. So this double optics provided us with the opportunity to preserve this fair view and also to express our attitude towards the choice of the material. For me, this is principally important that in this book we tried to provide the position of all the parties involved in the described events. And for me, it is really important that this is an open and book. We do not choose one ideological framework. We do not have one basic interpretation of what happened. We provide opportunity to everyone while reading this book to think again what happened with all of us in these years and to provide their own assessment, to argue, to continue the story that we only started to describe. So there are different positions that were identified, different public positions were presented. And so was it difficult to refrain from different interpretations of what was said by different people? It was difficult to avoid all assessments. It is impossible to do in any case. There is a personal position, but let's say for us it was important that our position was not dominant, even if we had some grounds for this, some emotional or factual grounds for this. So we checked facts, those facts that were not proven, so we didn't include them. So we tried to avoid these unverified facts. So you have 5 minutes, but we give it to the next speaker. So I read this book yesterday, and I thought it was great that we wrote this book. And my colleagues ask, why do we have so many books about Maidan, and why do we need one more? And I thought about it yesterday, that whether we will have new readers, new circles of readers in 20 or 30 years. This is interesting. So we have such pages there. They can be like book of history, how we live through the situation then. And we had a person who we had some comments from Mikhail Mikhailovich Gonchar and other colleagues, and the story about after Revolution of Dignity, how some people tried to create a third Maidan, and I carried out an investigation, and I was helped by some hacker community from Kharkiv, and sometimes I provide black and white picture of the events, but here Georgi corrected me more, and so this is a patriotic story about Maidan, and I believe that we all have some banned, liquidated friends or colleagues that are in Russia or on the other side of the front line, and now you do not have those people in your life, and it happened so, but I believe that theoretically it is possible that in 5 or more years good things will win, and these people, they will take this book in their hands and they will read it, and they will open once again for themselves our Ukraine, our history. And it's most dramatic and its biggest revolution. So we brought 70 books to Russia. It is not prohibited. There is no word Maidan on the front page, and we were allowed to bring 25 through Belarus border, and the Belarusian issue is raised in this book, that this was about the Minsk agreements, but we found new ways how to provide this book there. So you found 45 people in Belarus who want to read this book. No, they returned these books. So this is an interesting story how we send this book there. I will continue.
I will tell you a small secret. The presentation of this book is also planned in Moscow. I'm not going to tell you where it's going to be held, but the book itself was sponsored. We were assisted in publishing this book by the Европейский Dialog, I think, was the name of the organization that is based in Moscow. It's an international organization. And so it's this Европейский Dialog organization that is going to organize this, to hold this presentation. And it's one of the reasons why the book is published only in Russian, not in Ukrainian, because we wanted to inform about these events the public outside of Ukraine too. Thank you. From your standpoint, what are the most important features of that book, and what was your input, so to say, in making this book, in having this book published, written and published? Well, for me it was quite difficult to participate in this project because I do not like being edited. I would like to write freely without any supervision, and but I understand that in a book of this sort, where you have a lot of co-authors, there should be some editing so that the style could be made more or less uniform, so that different authors do not, represent some striking differences. But my attitude was also emotional because I participated in those events, and at that time I was emotionally somehow very much touched by the events of 2014, because some things that I wanted to happen didn't happen, and something that I didn't want, it happened, and some of my close connections perished even during those events. And yet before the so-called Orange Revolution, I was writing about the effort of the Russian authorities to somehow break up the then Ukrainian president Leonid Kuchma. I was writing about all these things for a long time, and it transpires in my piece in this book. My general impression is that this book as a final product is a good book, is a good product, and when I remember that the preface was written 2 weeks before the publication of the book, before the book went into print. And I must say that reading that book, I feel indebted to some of the people who took part in those events of 2014, and Victoria and Mustafa. I think you need to write about these events as you were the participants in them. Maybe even about some most difficult parts of those events. Max, it's the same regards you. I think you should take into account the fact that not enough has been written about the events at Maidan. You said that a lot of books have been written. It is true, but they are not enough in my view. And I'd say that these events were significant, revolutionary, not only for Ukraine but also for Russia. I would say that even in Russia it brought about significant changes. And Therefore, I think that this request should be addressed to the historians, Ukrainian historians. They need to write about these events. And I think that this is a debt of the Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukrainian writers to their people. Well, I'd say that this book is not a classical, so to say, historical book about history. If it were an academic, so to say, edition, it could contain some, alphabetic lists of main facts and dates and so on, as is common for the academic editions, academic books. And some more features are unique to that book. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now an opportunity to put some questions to the authors of the book. How are you? My question is how this book is going to be distributed here in Ukraine. Where could we buy it? Well, the usual distribution effort. We send the information to the bookstores. Those who would like to put it on their shelves for sale, they could do it. So far, we have not yet a lot of orders from the bookstores, and we have also our site and our pages in Facebook. And you can also get that book by our website. What's the price going to be? It's in Ukrainian hryvnias is going to be around 200. I'm a freelancer, and I welcome the publication of this book, and I'm sure that this book would play the role that was intended by its authors. My question regards some terminological issues. Revolution is a rather pompous word for this for those events. I understand that people tend to participate in something that is grandiose, revolution. I would call it an uprising. The revolution is something that brings about radical changes, radical transformation. Here it was clearly about the power, about the authority, who would come to power, who would be the next government. What's your view? Well, I'd say that we view those events of 2014 more as a revolution, because uprising is a one-time event, so to say. It starts and finishes rather quickly. But the events that started in 2014, they involved, I would say, even maybe millions of people. And these events were lengthy, and as was mentioned already, these events in 2014, they triggered some of the developments that, in my view, have been continuing until now. And as one of the Soviet songs ran, the revolution has the beginning but does not have the end. That's my impression of the events of 2014 here. I represent the museum of this Revoluция Гідності, and speaking about the number of books, I'd say that if we had in our museum about 160 books, different books about the events of 2014, today there are more than there are more of these books, and I'm sure that this book will be added to these books of about the events of 2014. And my other question is, what were the sources for your book? Well, I'd say that the politicians some who wrote some of the parts of that book could be the source in themselves. But, for example, I participated in the meetings of the Council of the National Security and Defense of Ukraine. I'd say that the documents, the majority of the documents adopted by during its meetings are classified and cannot be included into this book. Speaking about politicians, and I consider myself a politician, I'd say that a lot of things that some of the politicians write and might yet write about those events might not be to the liking of the other politicians. For example, even when we speak about the government, how the first government was approved and the composition of the first government was changed practically. The first composition was blocked and the government was different. The government that was appointed was different from its initial composition. And the other things that are subjective, they are in that book. They can be called subjective, but that's okay. And I'd say that the number of authors and the interviews with them and their stories make this book balanced on the whole, and I'd say rather objective. And as they say, everything secret eventually becomes public. This principle, I think, will certainly prove valid in the future. But today we are now a struggling or even fighting country, and certain things are classified and certain documents remain classified. And I would object to what you say. I'd say that you need to write what you remember now, put it into a safe, and then after some time it could be published. I would agree with what you said, that there are around slightly more than 20 interviews from the people who personally participated in the events of 2014, and the other materials are the stories and the information from the other publications that were included in that book. They were open, so to say, sources. Nothing classified has been included in that book. Well, before discussing this need to write more and more about the events of Maidan, I would like to say that I remember that there was a question asked in 2014. The participants probably were asking themselves what to do with Maidan, and I, as one of them, prepared my proposals for the popular which is a long-standing traditional meeting of the citizenry, dating back to the Rus of Kiev yet, and so this proposal were developed by myself and presented to leader of the party of which I was a member. The leader was Mr. Lutsenko, and but he advised me not to pursue this idea. And well, Mr. Anatoly, I advise you to write all your memories and put them for later prepare them for later publication. In the meantime, your question is, well, my question is related to that idea. Well, yes, you need to put a question, and our panelists will answer your question. Well, my idea could be presented to mass media, but I didn't present it to mass media, and I will tell you that I was guided by the principles well, you haven't asked the question. Well, let me put the question whether any one of you need any documents related to that proposal. Well, I'd say that you have here the representative of the museum of that revolution, and you can give her this document. Indeed, it's an interesting document. But the whole long story of your making that preparing that document, then not giving it to anyone, not forwarding it to any, it's another story. Well, the question is whether that book be published in Ukrainian. Well, as I told you at the beginning, it was more interesting it seems more interesting for us to publish this book in English rather than Ukrainian, because the audience would be larger. And I hope that the Institute of Ukraine, or I do not remember the exact name of that institution, they might try and translate it into English and publish it in English. Ms. Polina, I think that regardless of the language in which the book is published, I think the distribution of this book in Ukraine is also important. Well, certainly, let us acknowledge the fact that it is a big success that we managed to publish it. Well, I agree, but I just want to stress the fact that regardless of the language, it should be distributed in Ukraine. I am going to use what is called in Ukraine the administrative resource, meaning usually the authority of governmental officials, of governmental bureaucracy. I think that I will wield some of these bureaucratic powers that I have as a secretary of a parliamentary committee, and we will review the possibility of publishing a translation and publication of this book. Could be. I will try to make it so that they could be sponsored by the government of Ukraine. My quest, I would like to say that this book is very important because it's about the events that are quite important, were quite important, and therefore I call on everyone read this book and the other similar books, because it's about very important book, and it was about the struggle of good and evil. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, when we speak about things that were written and published, or written and not published, about the Revolution Hidnosti, we sometimes limit ourselves to reviewing only the books, but in reality, during those events, all mass media were functioning. They were functioning before the events at Maidan, and during the events of Maidan, and after those events. And so maybe we can, maybe someone can just collate all these publications. For example, Gromadske Radio, which I represent, they also we also were covering day by day all those events. And so I invite everyone who is watching this meeting or listening to our meeting, you could do that. And an inevitable question, what are your plans for the future? Well, the first thing you need to do is to take some rest after you have completed this publication. Well, after we, I would say that after we get some impressions from the first readers. I think we could try and make some improvements. Maybe we would read, we would gather the impressions from the readers, and maybe for the next edition make some additions, add something that the readers might be interested in reading about. Well, the question to the owner of, or to the director of the printing house. Well, as we were already mentioning, the need to translate this book I would also say that those who are going to read this book, they should pay attention to the parentheses that are used in the book. Sometimes the parentheses are not done by us, but by life itself. And sometimes we use parentheses when we use the parentheses even with the words like victory or treason or something like that. In one of my books, the main character was asked to smile, but he didn't want to. And he was given a machine gun, and when after a number of invitations, a producer hit Michael McDowell, or who is Michael Travis, with the stack of paper, and after that he smiled. It was a script of the movie, those papers. Well, the events were certainly both joyful and tragic, and we also only have 5 minutes remaining. Who would like to say the final word? I think that it's important to say that this book contains the hope and transmits the hope that the events were not in vain, the events of 2014, and something positive could, they could result in something positive eventually. Well, I'd say that after Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, I think this book could help us to look back at those events of 2014 and indeed say that the efforts were not in vain. My impression that I want to share with you is that the third revolution in Ukraine in these few years is probably not going to happen. My impression is that Ukraine, with despite all the problems and illnesses, so to say, is getting better. I hope, I would like to express my hope that all that happened in 2014 was not in vain. And I hope that we will continue along this path. Victoria, the floor is yours. I must say that Mustafa and I, when we discussed, had a discussion before this meeting, I think that we both came to a conclusion that we will remember the events of Maidan for as long as we live. It was so important they were so important for us. And we have lived through many difficulties, through many situations, and I think that we still have hope that all these events, all these difficulties would result in something positive for Ukraine. I share Igor's view that this book will help us after some time to look back and have these evidence of the events as they were in 2014. I would be even briefer. I hope that we resisted successfully and we are going to win. I'd say maybe it's there is a lot of it's somewhat bombastic, but I'd say that we have already won. Although the new people came, and some of those people were not specialists in those spheres of government, for example, that they filled in. But I hope that eventually these new people, they bring about our victory in politics, in the hostilities, and so on. And this book is very helpful, this book is going to be helpful in describing the history of our victory, because all the history that is taught, all the history of Ukraine as it is described as Ukraine is, is the history of losses and defeats. Well, my hope is smaller than those expressed by some of you. I just hope that after there is the second edition of this book is out of print, a number of copies could be presented to Gromadskie Radio. And thank you all for your attention, for your participation. I would like to thank thank simultaneous interpreters that assisted us. Thank you, and as the book has not yet been translated into English, at least it was told about in English.